welcome to the deep dive. Today, for you, we're diving straight into a really critical and, well, complicated issue. The allegations of violations of international humanitarian law in the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict.
Yeah, it's definitely complex.
We pulled together a range of important sources. There's an explainer on IHL from ReliefWeb, a statement from Germanwatch, which offers quite a specific perspective, an analysis on IHL application from Human Rights Watch.
Also a legal article from the Leiden Journal of International Law, which is quite detailed.
Right, and a focused report from Human Rights Watch specifically on the really troubling issue of forced displacement in Gaza. So our mission here in this deep dive is really to pull out the key insights from these documents, kind of unpack the core legal dimensions of this incredibly difficult situation for you.
That's right. And it's vital to understand this isn't about taking political sides, not at all. Instead, we're focusing squarely on the established framework of international law, the rules that are meant to govern armed conflict. And the foundation, really the bedrock of all this, is international humanitarian law, or IHL.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit for everyone listening. So this IHL, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, basically, it's a set of rules. Its roots are in the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and also what's called customary international law.
Customary law, meaning?
Meaning principles and practices that states have just accepted as legally binding over time, Think of it as the essential rulebook for wartime.
Okay, a rulebook.
Yeah, and its main purpose is sort of twofold. First, protect people who aren't fighting or who aren't fighting anymore, like civilians or soldiers who've surrendered.
Right.
And second, it sets limits on the kinds of weapons and the methods of warfare that can legally be used.
If I'm getting this right, this rulebook applies universally to everyone involved in a conflict.
Precisely. It puts obligations on all parties. Doesn't matter if they're states with big armies or non-state armed groups. And there are some really fundamental prohibitions at the heart of IHL. Things like indiscriminate attacks, attacks that don't distinguish between military targets and civilians.
Yeah, that seems crucial.
Definitely. Also, directly targeting civilians is absolutely forbidden, and the practice of collective punishment, penalizing a whole group for what a few did, that's completely out.
And it's important to say right up front, for everyone following along, that our sources, well, they raise serious allegations of these very kinds of violations against both Israeli and Palestinian combatants.
Absolutely.
We'll be digging into those specific allegations more as we go.
Yeah, it's a deeply complex situation. You've got claims and counterclaims from all sides, and our goal here is just to look at these claims through the lens of the law, the legal framework.
Okay, let's start with the perspective from Germanwatch. They bring a pretty interesting angle, especially considering Germany's history and its relationship with Israel.
Yeah, what's really striking there when you look at their position is how much emphasis they put on recognizing Israel's fundamental right to exist as a state.
Okay.
And this stance, it's deeply tied to historical responsibility from the Holocaust and also the ongoing reality of anti-Semitism. For Germanwatch, that's like a non-negotiable starting point.
And they bring in this concept, German Staatsräson, a matter of state. How does that play into their analysis for you?
Well, Germanwatch argues that while solidarity with the Israeli people is absolutely essential, born from protecting basic human dignity, this solidarity shouldn't automatically mean unconditional support for every action the Israeli government takes, especially when those actions are alleged to violate human rights or international law.
So for us to grasp their point, it's about making a clear line between Israel's right to exist and the specific actions of its government.
Exactly. And they apply that same principle when looking at the Palestinian people, too. Germanwatch stresses that human dignity, human rights, international law, these also underpin and crucially limit solidarity with Palestinians. They also have a right, and an inalienable right, to a peaceful, self-determined life. Secure borders, all of that.
They also offer a critical view on the cycle of violence, don't they?
Yes. They pose a tough question. Have Hamas's actions actually helped the Palestinian people? They suggest their acts of terror have just made the path to peace harder. And they also express serious doubts about whether Israel's current military offensive, given its intensity, is truly serving Israel's long-term security, especially considering the incredibly high civilian cost.
Germanwatch also specifically mentions the UN Security Council's recent call, the one for a ceasefire and hostage release.
That's right, the resolution from March 25th, 2025. It shows this growing urgency, this concern in the international community about needing to de-escalate the violence and deal with the worsening humanitarian crisis.
It's also quite sobering to hear about the impact this conflict is having within Germany itself.
Indeed. Germanwatch points to a really worrying increase in anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, anti-Israeli, anti-Palestinian, and other racist incidents right there in Germany. They strongly emphasize upholding freedom of assembly and expression, basic democratic principles. But they also clearly condemn any hate speech, glorifying violence, using dehumanizing language. It's a tough balance they're trying to strike for Germany.
So what specific demands does Germanwatch make on the German government and the EU based on all this?
Well, their demands are sort of multi-layered. First, a big increase in humanitarian aid for Gaza. The need is desperate, urgent.
Okay.
Second, they push Germany and the EU to really prioritize human dignity and international law in how they deal with the conflict. Diplomatically, politically, they want active work towards a ceasefire, towards peace.
And the weapons issue.
Right. Finally, they tackled the really sensitive topic of weapons exports to Israel. They acknowledge Israel's security needs, yes, but they also stress the obligation not to supply weapons if there's a credible risk they'll be used for serious human rights violations. For Germanwatch, it's about balancing security needs with the absolute imperative to follow international law.
Okay, moving on now. Let's get into the analysis from Human Rights Watch on how IHL is actually supposed to apply here. What are the absolute fundamentals they focus on for us?
Human Rights Watch really zeroes in on the bedrock of IHL, the principle of distinction.
Distinction.
Yeah. It means warring parties must, at all times, clearly distinguish between combatants, people actively fighting, and civilians who aren't. Civilians and civilian objects, homes, schools, hospitals, places of worship, they can never be the target of an attack, period.
So only combatants and military objectives.
Exactly. Only combatants and military objectives, things that directly help the enemy's military effort, are legitimate targets under IHL.
And it's not just about not intentionally targeting civilians, right? There's more to it.
Precisely. IHL goes further. It puts a positive duty and obligation on attackers to take all feasible precautions to minimize harm to civilians and civilian objects.
Feasible precautions.
Like rigorously checking targets to make sure they really are military objectives. Choosing weapons and tactics that are least likely to cause unintended civilian casualties or damage. It's an active responsibility.
They also talk about indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, don't they?
Yes, absolutely fundamental prohibitions. An attack is indiscriminate if it doesn't aim at a specific military target, or uses weapons that just can't be aimed properly, or hits a wide area with both military targets and civilians without trying to tell them apart.
Okay, that makes sense. And disproportionate.
Disproportionate is when the expected harm to civilians and civilian property is clearly excessive compared to the concrete direct military advantage you expect to gain. It's a balancing act, but civilian life and property have huge weight under the law.
What other key IHL obligations does Human Rights Watch highlight in their analysis for us?
They emphasize treating anyone taken into custody, POWs, detainees, with basic human dignity, always. And they underscore the absolute ban on taking hostages, and also using civilians as human shields to protect military targets. Both are strictly prohibited.
And what about warnings? We hear a lot about warnings before attacks.
Yeah, IHL does require parties to give effective advance warning of attacks that might affect civilians, unless the military situation makes it impossible. And HRW is very clear on this. Just giving a warning doesn't let an attacker off the hook. It doesn't absolve them of their responsibility to protect civilians. Even if civilians don't evacuate, they're still protected, still shouldn't be targeted.
That's a crucial point.
And furthermore, warnings that aren't genuine ones, meant mainly to spread terror and force people out rather than ensure safety, those are prohibited too.
Human Rights Watch also mentions their long-held legal view on the status of the territories, right?
Correct. They state clearly that in their legal assessment, Israel has been the occupying power in the occupied Palestinian territory, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza since 1967.
And being an occupying power comes with specific rules.
Yes, it carries a whole set of specific obligations under international law about how you treat the population and administer the territory.
And they finish by stressing accountability.
Yeah, HRW rightly points out that ensuring accountability for alleged IHL violations is absolutely vital. It's about justice for victims, yes, but it's also critical for deterring future atrocities, for preventing more abuses.
Okay, let's turn now to the more detailed legal dive from the Leiden Journal of International Law. They offer a really nuanced perspective on applying the law here for us to consider.
Indeed. The Leiden Journal gives really important historical context. They start with this series of Israeli military operations in Gaza since Hamas took power back in 2007.
Right, there have been several rounds of conflict.
But they're careful to point out that the post-October 7th operation, Iron Sword, is totally unprecedented. Different scale, different intensity, different impact compared to anything before.
They also provide key details about the October 7th attacks by Hamas, the ones that triggered this latest devastating round.
Yeah, and it's crucial to remember, as the journal lays out, the sheer horror of those attacks. Around 1,140 deaths in Israel, mostly civilians, deliberately targeted with, well, horrific brutality.
Awful.
Reports of sexual violence, beheadings, people burned alive, and about 250 hostages taken. That's critical context. They also note Israel's stated goals. Eliminate Hamas in Gaza, get the hostages back safely.
The article also touches on the complex legal questions around Palestinian statehood.
Yes, briefly. They mention the ongoing debate, the lack of universal agreement on Palestinian statehood under international law. They note Palestine's status as a UN non-member observer state, and that it's joined key treaties like the Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute of the ICC.
Why is joining those treaties significant?
It means that even though not everyone recognizes Palestine as a full state, Palestine itself has accepted the legal obligations in those crucial international agreements. They've opted in, so to speak.
Then there's that really big, legally tricky debate. Is Gaza still legally occupied territory after Israel pulled out ground troops and settlements in 2005?
This is a hugely important point of legal argument, with major implications for how IHL applies. As the article explains, even after pulling out ground forces and settlements, Israel kept effective control over Gaza's borders, its airspace, its coastal waters.
So some argue occupation law still applies.
Right. Some legal experts argue that this level of continued control, especially over who and what goes in and out, means the law of occupation still applies, at least in key ways.
But others disagree.
Others argue the intense fighting since October 7th and the lack of a continuous Israeli ground presence inside Gaza might have changed the legal status, even if Israel still has remote control. The core question is, does Israel still exercise enough effective overall control to trigger the specific duties of an occupying power? It's heavily debated.
And this legal uncertainty has real-world consequences for how IHL is applied, doesn't it, for people trying to understand this?
Absolutely. If occupation law applies, it puts a whole set of specific duties on the occupying power regarding the welfare and protection of the civilian population, ensuring essential services, facilitating aid, things like that.
The Leiden Journal then looks at potential IHL breaches by Israel concerning the destruction of things essential for civilian survival in Gaza.
Yes, this is a really grave area under IHL. The law specifically forbids attacking, destroying, removing, or making useless things essential for civilian survival.
Like what kind of things?
Hospitals, water systems, sanitation facilities, farmland needed for food, stuff like that. And this ban holds even if the main goal isn't deliberately starving civilians, but if destroying these things is a foreseeable outcome that's expected to lead to starvation or force people to move.
And the article says?
The article points to credible reports and assessments suggesting that the very survival of a large part of Gaza's population was put in serious danger right after Israel's big military response began.
And what does the Leiden analysis say about how Israel handled relief supplies getting into Gaza?
The article carefully tracks it. First, the initial near-total siege, cutting off almost all food, water, medicine, fuel, aid.
Right, I remember that.
Then later, a gradual easing. Some border crossings reopened, like Rafah and Kerem Shalom. Some limited fuel imports resumed.
But was it enough?
No. The Leiden Journal stresses the amount of aid allowed in has consistently been far, far below what the population actually needs. Plus, the fighting inside Gaza and extensive Israeli security checks have badly hampered getting aid delivered efficiently to the people who desperately need it.
What about other ways to get aid in, like airdrops?
They've been tried airdrops, the maritime corridor, but they've proven largely insufficient for the scale of the crisis. Aid groups widely report extremely tight Israeli control over what aid gets in and how much, causing huge delays, even cancellations of vital aid shipments.
Israel's repeated evacuation calls for civilians in Gaza, the Leiden Journal, analyzes those legally, too.
Yes. The article argues that these calls, whatever the Israeli military calls them, should legally be seen as displacement orders.
Why displacement orders?
Because in the middle of intense fighting, civilians are effectively being forced to leave their homes under the imminent threat of becoming victims. So these orders fall under the Law of Armed Conflict, LOAC, rules about population displacement.
And those rules apply broadly.
Yes, in both international and non-international armed conflicts. And crucially, they might apply even if the power ordering the displacement doesn't have continuous ground control. Forcing mass civilian displacement is a very serious thing under international law, only allowed under very strict conditions.
The article also gets into the alleged war crimes being looked at by the International Criminal Court prosecutor against leaders on both sides.
Right. They note that some alleged war crimes, like intentionally killing civilians or torture, are crimes under the ICC's Rome Statute in both international and non-international conflicts.
But others are more complicated.
Yes, things like disproportionate attacks or using starvation as a weapon of war. Their legal applicability can depend on how you classify the conflict in Gaza. Is it international state versus state, non-international state versus non-state group, or maybe both?
And the ICC prosecutor's approach.
The prosecutor mentioned pursuing a double classification theory, basically arguing it's an international conflict between Israel and Palestine and a non-international conflict between Israel and Hamas happening at the same time. This seems like a way to navigate the legal complexities and maybe widen the range of crimes that could potentially be prosecuted.
Lastly, the Leiden Journal looks at the case South Africa brought against Israel at the International Court of Justice, ICJ.
Right. The article focuses on the provisional measures the ICJ ordered in response to South Africa's case.
What were those measures about?
Mainly about the urgent need to prevent any acts that could plausibly amount to genocide under the Genocide Convention, and also to ensure humanitarian aid gets into Gaza without hindrance.
And they explain that legal term, erga omnes parts.
Yes, under the Genocide Convention. That Latin phrase basically means all states signed up to the convention have a shared interest in seeing it respected and have a legal right to call for its enforcement, even if they aren't directly affected by the alleged violations.
So the fact the ICJ issued measures is significant.
It is, because it suggests the court found South Africa's claims plausible, specifically the Palestinian people's right to be protected from genocide and South Africa's right as a party to the convention to demand it be respected. Plausible enough to need interim protection.
The Leiden Journal wraps up its legal analysis with a pretty sobering assessment for us then.
Yes. Their final point is that the Gaza conflict throws up incredibly deep and complex legal questions. They state there's, at the very least, a serious, credible risk that fundamental rules of international law have been violated by Israel, particularly concerning how attacks were conducted and the restrictions placed on humanitarian aid.
And obligations for other countries.
They also stress that all states have obligations to actively prevent violations of LOAC and genocide. This could potentially mean they have a duty to stop sending military gear to a warring party if there's a clear risk that gear could be used to commit serious violations of international law.
Okay, let's shift now to the Human Rights Watch report that focuses specifically on forced displacement within Gaza. They really personalize this for us, using the stories of Ghassan and Sarah, Palestinian residents.
Absolutely. Putting those individual experiences front and center really brings the stark reality of mass displacement into sharp human focus for you. It details the horrific October 7th attacks, yes, but then Israel's huge military response, the bombing, the ground attacks, the blockade, and there's very serious allegations about possibly using starvation as a weapon.
And their main finding from their investigation is pretty stark.
Yes. HRW concludes, based on their evidence, that Israel's actions in this offensive have intentionally caused the mass forced displacement of most of Gaza's civilian population.
Intentionally caused.
That's their finding. They argue the system of evacuation orders and so-called safe zones totally failed to provide real safety and, in many cases, actually put civilians in more danger. Their bottom line, nowhere in Gaza has been truly safe for civilians since this started.
The report goes into disturbing detail about the conditions on evacuation routes and even in those supposedly safe zones.
This is a really crucial and deeply troubling part of their findings for you. They document credible cases where civilians were hit by Israeli fire while trying to evacuate on designated routes like Salah al-Din Road. One person called it the passage of death.
Chilling.
And shockingly, they also detail attacks on areas the Israeli military itself had publicly called humanitarian safe zones, like the attack on a marked Médecins Sans Frontières MSF staff building in Al-Mawasi, even though MSF had repeatedly given the coordinates to Israeli authorities.
Human Rights Watch also makes specific recommendations to international actors based on this.
Yeah, they target donor states, companies, UN agencies, the ICC prosecutor. They urge them, don't fund or provide services that could contribute to abuses in Gaza. They stress that any future rebuilding must happen in real partnership with affected Palestinians based on their human rights. And crucially, they strongly push the ICC prosecutor to investigate Israeli authorities' actions on mass forced displacement and preventing return as potential crimes against humanity.
The report also explains how they reach these significant conclusions, their methodology.
They outline a really thorough approach. Lots of interviews, in-person and remote, with displaced Palestinians, analyzing tons of public info, social media, news reports, and carefully examining satellite images and geospatial data to independently verify events. It's a robust methodology that gives their findings weight.
The report also points to some pretty concerning statements reportedly made by Israeli officials.
Yes, they cite specific quotes from high-ranking officials, apparently indicating an intent to inflict maximum damage on Gaza, reduce it to ruins, alongside those huge evacuation orders. These statements raise serious questions under international law about proportionality and the intent behind the operations.
Let's dig into that first big evacuation order, October 13th, for northern Gaza. Over 1 million people. Tiny time frame. The humanitarian impact must have been immediate and massive, right?
The order for over 1 million people to leave northern Gaza in just 24 hours had exactly the catastrophic results many international groups, including the UN Secretary General, immediately warned about.
Right.
HRW highlights the huge gap between Israel's stated reasons, civilian safety, Hamas presence, and the reality on the ground. Extreme danger, nowhere safe or adequate to flee to. That reported statement by the Israeli president about an entire nation out there is responsible also raises very troubling questions about the principle of distinction.
And the HRW report emphasizes the complete lack of adequate protection during this evacuation.
Absolutely. Instead of ensuring safety, HRW argues Israel's simultaneous actions destroying infrastructure, cutting off water and electricity to all of Gaza intentionally undermine civilians' ability to survive, creating a severe humanitarian crisis.
The confusing, contradictory nature of later evacuation orders is also a key point in the report for us to grasp.
Yes, the report gives examples from Khan Yunis, Gaza City, where orders were unclear geographically, gave conflicting info about safe zones, sometimes even directed people to areas later attacked. It was chaotic, unpredictable, and endangered civilians.
And the personal stories.
The stories from people like Omar and Sahar really highlight the terror and danger of trying to follow these orders. Salah al-Din Road called the passage of death. And the report notes the extra difficulties for vulnerable kids, people with disabilities, like in Ghazal's story.
And the report chillingly documents attacks on areas Israel itself had designated as humanitarian zones, places people were told to go for safety.
This is maybe one of the most profoundly disturbing findings for you. Repeated attacks on Al-Mawasi, an area the Israeli military explicitly called a safe zone for displaced people. It shows a clear, deeply concerning failure to protect civilians, even where they were told to shelter.
Were there warnings for those attacks?
The report documents a lack of advance warning for some attacks, and just a general failure to ensure safety in these zones. It raises very serious questions about compliance with basic IHL.
Human Rights Watch also addresses the issue of Hamas possibly obstructing civilians from fleeing.
Well, their interviews didn't yield direct accounts of Hamas actively stopping people from leaving, but they do acknowledge underreporting is possible in such chaos.
Yeah.
They also clarify the legal definition of human shielding. It's about deliberately using civilians to shield military targets, not just militants being present in civilian areas.
The report also details the impact of cutting off essential services to all of Gaza.
Yes, meticulously. How cutting off water, electricity, fuel amounts to collective punishment strictly forbidden under IHL. This hit displaced people already incredibly vulnerable, particularly hard, worsening the dire humanitarian situation.
And the impact on farming and food.
Huge destruction of farmland, bakeries, disrupting food supplies led to a catastrophic food crisis. The repeated warnings from the IPC about a real risk of famine just underscore the extreme gravity.
And water. Sanitation.
Severe shortages of clean water, totally inadequate sanitation-fueled disease outbreaks, creating a public health emergency on top of everything else.
The Human Rights Watch report includes some incredibly powerful quotes from displaced Palestinians.
Yeah.
They really bring the suffering home for us.
Those first-hand accounts, Omar, Youssef, Sami, Yusra, Nadine, Saeed needing insulin, Lena from the destroyed towers, they're essential reading to grasp the human costs.
Just awful descriptions.
Raw descriptions of hunger, thirst, no shelter, constant fear. It shows the truly dire, unsustainable situation for most civilians in Gaza. And the widespread destruction of homes, infrastructure, those buffer zones, it raises serious concerns about the right of displaced Palestinians to ever return home.
The report concludes by looking at the legal concepts of forcible transfer and ethnic cleansing in relation to Gaza.
Right. HRW introduces forcible transfer, a crime against humanity under the ICC statute, and notes the ongoing ICC investigation into Palestine. They mention the right to redress for victims.
And ethnic cleansing.
They note it doesn't have a formal legal definition, but discuss its components, a policy to remove a group, often violently. They explain how preventing displaced people from returning home could be seen as a continuous crime against humanity.
Any legal precedent mentioned.
They reference the crises case from the Yugoslavia Tribunal, showing how creating an atmosphere of terror during displacement can point to forcible transfer, not lawful evacuation. And finally, they define persecution as a crime against humanity, severe deprivation of rights on discriminatory grounds.
Wow. This deep dive has really laid bare the incredibly complex and deeply concerning legal and humanitarian sides of this conflict. It's crystal clear from all these sources we've looked at today that there are numerous serious allegations of grave international law violations coming from multiple credible places.
Yes, and I think a really key takeaway for you, our listener, as you absorb all this, is that fundamental principle. International humanitarian law was specifically created, painstakingly built, to protect the most vulnerable people in wartime. But the picture painted by the sources we've discussed today strongly suggests these crucial legal protections are being seriously challenged and, in many cases, seemingly disregarded on the ground in Gaza.
And it leaves us finishing this deep dive with a really significant question for you to think about. Given all the legal complexities, the different interpretations of events, and just the staggering human suffering, what does real accountability for these alleged violations actually look like in such a deeply fraught situation?
Yeah.
And maybe even more fundamentally, what meaningful role can international law ultimately play in achieving a just, lasting peace for everyone in this deeply troubled region?
That's a profoundly important place to end. The legal frameworks are there, but making them work effectively, enforcing them impartially in a conflict this entrenched, this politically charged, that remains a huge ongoing challenge for the whole international community.
Definitely something to keep thinking about.
Absolutely. We strongly encourage you to keep exploring these critical issues, seek out diverse, credible information sources, and really engage in thoughtful reflection on these fundamental questions of law, justice, and basic human rights in the face of this ongoing tragedy.